At the Battle of Dyrrhachium, I took a blow that honestly felt like it knocked the wind right out of me. Once Pompey managed to punch through our blockade, there wasn't any sense in hanging on to those fortifications anymore. I pulled my men back, gathered everyone in one spot, and did my best to reorganize what was left of the army. After that, I found myself staring at a pretty tough decision. Staying where we were simply wasn't possible. My soldiers were exhausted, and their confidence had been shaken so badly that they needed time just to pull themselves together again. To make matters worse, our supplies were thinning out, and we had far too many injured and sick slowing us down. I had a few paths I could take. One option was to march across land back toward Italy, rebuild the army, and gather fresh recruits. But that trail was a miserable one, harsh, dry, and offering almost nothing in the way of food or shelter. And if I went that way, I'd also be abandoning the legions I had stationed out east, leaving them to handle their troubles alone. Sailing to Brundisium wasn't an option either. I had no fleet, and Pompey's ships practically owned the sea by that point. So really, when I laid everything out, I had only one choice that made sense. Push deeper into Greece, find the rest of my scattered forces, and try to rebuild my strength piece by piece. After giving the men a short rest, I led them into the rich farmland of Thessaly. Pompey could have headed for Italy too, either by sea or by marching through Illyria, and a lot of his advisors urged him to do just that, telling him he could secure Rome without too much trouble. But Pompey had other plans. He wanted to crush me once and for all. His troops were riding high after their recent success, and Pompey was convinced final victory was right there in front of him. So he marched after me. I reached Apollonia first, stocked up on supplies, and left behind the soldiers who were too sick or wounded to continue. Then I set out at a quick pace to link up with Domitius and his men. To move faster, I ordered our baggage train to go ahead of us, letting the rest of the army march light and cover a lot more ground than Pompey could. His troops were bogged down by their own baggage, which slowed them to a crawl. When Pompey realized he couldn't catch me himself, he sent his cavalry ahead. They managed to reach my rearguard near a bridge over the river Gnaeus. They tried to force a fight and hold the crossing, but they weren't any match for my Gallic cavalry. My men pushed them back hard and secured the bridge. From there, I kept moving toward Domitius, going through Epirus and Athymania. Pompey headed toward Macedonia as well, but he took a different road, passing through the region of Candavia. Meanwhile, Domitius had been blockading Scipio's army for quite a while. There were plenty of little clashes and plenty of blood spilled on both sides, but neither force was willing to risk a full, decisive battle. Both Pompey and I sent out messengers and orders all over the place during this time. Pompey's couriers spread the news of my defeat everywhere they went, and that rumor alone caused many towns to switch their allegiance to him. Some of them even refused to give my troops food or forage. With all the chaos, messages between Domitius and me almost never made it through. Only the one telling him to march and join me got through reliably. Even then, Domitius was still in the dark about the exact route I was taking or where we'd meet. He broke camp and pushed his men hard along the shortest road, the Via Egnatia, toward Dyrrhachium and Apollonia, hoping to intercept me. But marching toward him on that same road was Pompey's entire army. By pure luck, they missed running straight into each other by only 4 hours. Domitius got word from his scouts just in time, turned his men around, and eventually caught up with me near Aeginium, close to the Thessalian border. Once our forces reunited, we headed straight for the town of Gomphi. Gomphi had supported me once, but after hearing about my defeat at Dyrrhachium, they changed sides and shut their gates in my face. I decided we'd take the place by force. It didn't take long. The city fell within a few hours, and I let my troops sack it. From there, I marched on to Metropolis, and they opened their gates without any resistance. Meanwhile, after Domitius left his blockade to join me, Scipio pulled his men back to Larissa, where Pompey caught up with him. Their armies joined together, and not long after, Pompey and I found ourselves close enough to make camp near Pharsalus. Pompey set up on a high hill at the base of the mountains, and I settled in the valley below. In Pompey's camp, the senators were pushing him hard to force a decisive battle, but he held back and chose to wait. My supplies were running dangerously low. Day after day, I shifted my camp closer to his, lined up my troops, and tried to provoke him into fighting. Pompey mirrored nearly everything I did, keeping his legions stationed up on the hillside right beside his camp. From that position he had the high ground locked down, which meant he'd have a big advantage if the fighting ever started. Even so, he kept holding back, no matter how much pressure his allies piled on him to attack. I later said he had around 55,000 men, though modern folks argue it was closer to 40,000. My own army was sitting at about 30,000 soldiers, and Pompey easily outmatched me in cavalry, 7,000 of his horsemen to barely 1,000 of mine. Still, my legions had far more experience in real combat, and their morale was miles ahead of his. Eventually I realized that trying to bait Pompey into a fight just wasn't going to work. So I finally started breaking camp, planning to march off and restock supplies before things got any worse for us. The moment Pompey saw this, he made up his mind to fight at last. He brought his whole army out of camp and lined them up on the slope, almost at the bottom of the hill, convinced that my men would wear themselves out climbing upward and be easier to break. Pompey anchored his right flank on the river Aenipius and stretched his left wing out across the flat plains. He used the classic Roman setup, 3 solid lines of heavy infantry. His left flank was reinforced with light infantry and archers, and every bit of his cavalry was gathered there under Titus Labienus. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus held the right wing, Scipio commanded the center, and Lentulus ran the left. Pompey himself positioned right there on the left flank too. His plan was simple and bold. Keep his infantry steady and defensive, and when the moment was right, unleash his entire cavalry force straight into my right flank. The idea was to break my formation, swing behind my men, hit their rear, and crush them completely in one sweeping attack. I arranged my army in 3 lines as well. My own left flank rested on rough ground close to the Aenipius, while my right stretched out across open, flat land. On the left I placed the 8th and 9th legions, both so worn down from earlier battles that together they barely counted as a single full legion anymore. On the right stood my most loyal, battle-tested troops, the 10th Legion. The 11th and 12th held the center. Antony commanded the left wing, Domitius took the center, and Sulla handled the right. I stood opposite Pompey myself, facing him directly. To match Pompey's line in width and keep from getting outflanked, I had to thin my formation. My maniples ended up 6 ranks deep instead of 10 like Pompey's. When I saw he had stacked nearly all of his cavalry on his left flank, I knew exactly what he intended. To counter that, I pulled together a reserve of about 3,000 men, picked cohorts from all my legions, men I trusted, and gave them very specific instructions before posting them behind my right wing. I also placed my tiny cavalry force there with them. The battle kicked off when my first and second lines moved forward together, closing the distance. Normally, since both armies were Roman, you'd expect the old tradition. Wait until you're almost nose to nose, then suddenly rush the enemy in a burst of speed. My men geared themselves up for just that. They climbed the slope at a strong march, shields lifted, then burst into a run at what they judged was the perfect moment. But Pompey's soldiers didn't charge down to meet them. Realizing they'd burn themselves out running uphill into an unmoving wall of shields, my men slowed halfway up, took a moment to catch their breath, and then charged again. They hurled their pila, reached for their swords, and slammed into Pompey's line all at once. The enemy held firm, absorbed the impact, and answered with their own volley of pila before crashing into us in brutal close combat. The fight tore across the entire front line, and step by step my troops began pushing them back. We broke through their first ranks, but soon got caught in a grinding, exhausting melee. And right then, Pompey set his cavalry loose on his left flank along with his archers. My small cavalry force moved up to intercept them. Lentulus' horsemen charged hard, and after a short, violent clash, they overwhelmed my riders and forced them to fall back. The 7-to-1 advantage made the outcome all but guaranteed. Pompey's cavalry was now ready to swing around and smash into the side of my line. Just at that moment I gave the signal to my reserve. 3,000 of my legionaries surged forward straight toward Pompey's charging horsemen. Following my orders, those 3,000 men didn't hurl their pila the way Roman soldiers normally would. Instead, They gripped them like long spears and charged straight into Pompey's cavalry at close range. Packed tight shoulder to shoulder, they slammed forward with so much force that they not only stopped the horsemen cold, but actually pushed them backward. Pompey's riders had counted on an easy attack against what they thought was an open flank, so running straight into a solid wall of spear points caught them completely off guard. In moments, their pullback turned into a full-on rout, and just like that, my right flank was safe. My legionaries didn't waste time chasing fleeing horsemen. That job was left to the few cavalrymen I still had standing. Instead, staying exactly in line with my commands, they wheeled together as one body and charged straight for the enemy archers. Pompey's light infantry and archers had nobody protecting them now, and when my men hit them with their full momentum, those troops collapsed almost instantly and scattered in panic. Without pausing to chase them, my soldiers turned again and smashed into Pompey's exposed left flank and rear. At the same moment, the veterans of my 10th Legion were pressing their attack harder than ever. Pompey's infantry still held their ground for a while, but then I sent in my entire third line, fresh men who hadn't fought yet. Those rested sentries surged forward, relieved the exhausted troops in front, and struck Pompey's line all at once. That finally broke them. The Pompeian soldiers began falling back, and their retreat turned into a total rout. Before long, Pompey's whole army was running. They made a brief attempt to defend the ramparts around their camp, but after a short clash at the gates and fortifications, my troops overwhelmed them completely. Once Pompey's cavalry fled, he slipped away from the battlefield himself and went back to his tent. When the fighting reached its peak, his troops fully collapsed, and my legionaries stormed into the camp chasing them down. Seeing there was no hope left, Pompey fled through the rear gate with only a handful of his closest companions. Nightfall ended up being the only thing that saved the men still trying to escape. Those who scattered into the nearby hills tried to make their way to Larissa, but my soldiers moved fast through the dark and cut off every route. What remained of Pompey's army surrendered in huge numbers. Ancient historians say somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000 of his men were killed, and over 20,000 captured. My own losses were heavy too, possibly up to 4,000 killed. Only a small number of Pompey's men managed to slip away from death or capture. Nearly all the aristocrats who surrendered were pardoned and released by me, including Marcus Junius Brutus, who, ironically, would one day take part in my assassination. Of Pompey's commanders, only Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was killed during the pursuit. The rank and file were also pardoned. Many of them even chose to join my army, while the rest were allowed to go home. After fleeing the battlefield, Pompey headed for Larissa. His companions urged him to sail for Utica, where a lot of his remaining supporters had gathered, or to go east into Asia and ask the Parthians for help. But Pompey chose Egypt instead. He'd built an alliance there years before with King Ptolemy and assumed the Egyptians would welcome him warmly. From Larissa, he rushed to the coast, boarded a merchant ship, and traveled by way of Amphipolis, Mytilene, Cilicia, and finally to Paphos on Cyprus. From there, he sent a message to the Egyptian king asking permission to land in Alexandria. I, determined not to give him even a sliver of a chance to regroup and restart the war, immediately set out in pursuit. Meanwhile, fighting still rattled the Roman world as our two factions clashed across different fronts. The Pompeian commander Livius pulled off another version of Libo's old raid and captured an island near the harbor of Brundisium. From there, he was able to keep a close grip on my fleet. Not even small naval losses or supply shortages pushed him into giving up the blockade. He only withdrew after hearing about Pompey's crushing defeat at Pharsalus. Around that same time, Pompey's Admiral Cassius arrived in Sicily with several squadrons of ships. My fleet in the region was split between two harbors, one at Messina and the other at Vibo. Cassius struck Messina first, catching my men completely off guard. They hadn't expected a sudden attack and hadn't even set proper patrols. He hit the fleet while it was at anchor, using fireships to burn it to cinders before sailing on to Vibo. There, he surprised my forces again and managed to destroy part of the fleet, but this time he ran into stiff resistance and had to pull back. Meanwhile, Pompey received word from Egypt granting him permission to land at Alexandria. In truth, though, young Ptolemy had already decided Pompey was too much trouble and secretly planned to have him killed. He sent his guard commander, Achilles, along with Septimius, a Roman military tribune who had once known Pompey, to meet him. Pompey stepped onto the small boat meant to bring him ashore, suspecting nothing, and there Achilles and Septimius murdered him.